Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hi, everyone. We're back for another episode in Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. As you know, a little while ago, we decided to do a multi-episode series on the history of religious freedom in the United States during this year, America's 250th, because we believe it is one of our greatest innovations and absolutely essential in understanding the country's past, present, and charting its future. Today, we'll be getting some help from Michael McConnell, a nationally recognized expert on this subject. Professor McConnell is the Richard and Frances Mallery Professor and Faculty Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School, Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution, and from 2002 to 2009 was Circuit Judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. He has briefed or argued many, if not most, of the religious freedom cases in the Supreme Court from the 1980s until now. Professor McConnell is the author of The President Who Would Not Be King, Executive Power Under the Constitution, and co-author with Nathan Chapman of Agreeing to Disagree, How the Establishment Clause Protects Religious Diversity and Freedom of Conscience. Michael, thanks so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Can you tell us what religious freedom looked like in the colonies before the founding?
Well, yes. So, assuming the founding begins, shall we say, with the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago, it looked very different than shortly thereafter. Every state south of Pennsylvania had an established church, a single established church, which is the Church of England. Now, some of those places were more rigid and exclusive, and some were more tolerant. Virginia was pretty exclusive and intolerant, and Georgia, interestingly, although it had an established church, was quite welcoming to religious minorities. Now, north of that, beginning with Pennsylvania, the middle colonies tended not to have any established church and were places where there were religious freedom was pretty strong, and in some places there had never been an established church there. New England was a different story. Outside of Rhode Island, every state in New England had what we call a localized establishment of religion. That doesn't mean one state church for the whole state, but each town would vote for itself who would be the minister and therefore who would be the denomination. Now, nine times out of 10, I don't know, 98% of the time, most of the time, in New England, that meant a Puritan, or what by the time of the founding would be called a Congregationalist minister. Now, in both the North and the South, established churches generally involved compulsory attendance laws, where people are actually criminally punished for failing to attend church a certain number of times without a good reason, and also mandatory church contributions. And so, this was not a regime of religious freedom. Now, with the Declaration of Independence, things changed because the Church of England was headed by the king. And when we're fighting a war of independence against the king, it didn't make very much sense to have an established church which was so tied up with royal authority. And so the Church of England was disestablished throughout the places where it previously had held sway. This was less because of a principled objection to the idea of establishment of religion than it was that it just made no sense to establish a church based upon royal authority. The localized establishment in New England remained, and if anything, was solidified because the Congregationalist ministers in those places were, to a man, supportive of the revolution and really were very important to the to the intellectual and psychological and emotional commitment of the country to independence. And so the establishment survived in those states. Now, immediately after independence, that was the story, but there were efforts in many of the states to adopt a multiple establishment. That would be where individual people did have to support and maybe have to attend a church, but they could choose which one. So there wouldn't be a single established church, but there would be a requirement of supporting some kind of church. That could be from a narrow range. In some places, that meant among the Protestant churches, and sometimes it could be a broader range. Those efforts got some political success, but ultimately sputtered out. And so that was not actually the pattern.
Okay. Okay, that's a great picture you painted for us of what this looked like on the eve of revolution and a little bit post. Um,
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely. Yep.
In just before the Declaration in 1774, James Madison actually wrote a letter to his friend William Bradford, his college buddy, uh, complaining because in the next county over in Virginia, there were, he said, 5 or 6 pious ministers. These were Baptist ministers, and they were actually in jail for preaching without a license. So that shows you just how tight the Virginia establishment was before independence.
Right. No, that's a great story. Yep, absolutely. Uh, so maybe you could tell us, in your opinion, some of the 2 or 3 most important people and ideas in establishing religious freedom in the United States as defined as we have it now in Article 6 and the First Amendment religion clauses.
So there were a number of ideas that contributed to the growth of religious freedom, but there would be like 3 that I would identify as most important. The first was theological. This is actually a religious belief that to be valid in the eyes of God, a belief had to be sincere, it had to be voluntary, that if we worship God because we're being told to, or we'd be punished if we weren't, that is of no value. The way even relatively more secular people, not Orthodox people, often believe this. Thomas Jefferson, who was anything but an Orthodox believer, began his bill, the bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia, which he authored, begins with a theological declaration, which is well aware that Almighty God hath created the mind free. So this is actually a religious idea. It's not, and yet it has important constitutional and legal ramifications if you take it seriously. A second idea was much more practical and based upon the history of religious conflict in Europe in particular, that when there were attempts to establish a religion, this kicked off fights and oftentimes wars, battles, persecution of people, because if one religion is going to win out, then the others are going to lose, and people really care about their religions, and so you can't have a state-supported church without a fight over which church is going to be supported, and beginning with English thinkers like John Locke, but extending, certainly to our founders. Madison wrote eloquently about this. The solution to this was, not to try to change religion, not to try to reduce people's religious spirit, but rather to reduce the role of government, because the peaceful solution to religious diversity is to allow everyone to worship God in accordance with their own conscience. So this is a civil idea and has to do with public peace. The third idea, which is certainly growing and very strong at the time of our founding, is a somewhat more broadly libertarian idea. We might call it freedom of thought or freedom of the mind. Freedom of speech is closely related to this, and this is a an idea that human beings are entitled. They have natural rights to be able to think for themselves, to speak for themselves, to decide what they believe, to act in accordance with those beliefs, unless that action actually interferes with equally precious natural rights of others. And so this goes beyond just religion, but religion was at the centerpiece of this idea of civil liberty.
Okay. Super. So you mentioned James Madison, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson. Are those the two individuals, the two actors on the stage, so to say, that loom largest that we really need to understand as uh, principal people who made this happen, or are there some others?
So the way we tell American history, Jefferson and Madison are front and center,
Right.
partly because of how eloquent they were, partly because of their importance in American history in general. But it's worth remembering, and Madison, I think, really especially deserves this position because he was the person who insisted upon the addition of a Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution at a time when they had a lot of things on their plate getting a new government underway, and Madison's role is key. But the fights over religious freedom took place in every state, and Madison and Jefferson were in Virginia. I mean, Madison had a role in the at the national level, but there were important figures in these controversies in every state. A lot of religious figures were important in it as well. There was a difference of opinion between some religious denominations about what the role of the state should be with respect to religion. And so I would, mention names like, Fisher Ames in Massachusetts, who actually is the author of the Free Exercise Clause in the U.S. Constitution. Gouverneur Morris in New York in 1777, the New York formed its first state constitution, and there was a big fight where a number of people, led by the future Chief Justice John Jay, wanted to exclude Catholics from citizenship in New York. Gouverneur Morris, whose ancestors, by the way, grandparents, I believe they were, had actually been persecuted in France
Mm.
by Catholics. So he was a child of this kind of persecution, and he really fought. He fought persistently and successfully not to bar Catholics from New York, but rather to establish a broad free exercise right in that important state. So yes, Jefferson and Madison get the glory in a sense in the
Right.
way American history is taught, but there were a number of other figures up and down the coast which who had important roles to play.
I think that's a great insight to get down a little bit deeper into the details, go state by state, and look at the people who are speaking about it, against it. So, great suggestion. Let's. So that was then important. The history of its formation within the Constitution, who did it, what the ideas were, but we're now 250 years later. Um, can you help us get from then to now by talking about maybe several key American historical events that impacted religious freedom over the years? And then afterwards, let's separately talk about key legal cases.
Yes, and so, this will sound like kind of an unhappy story because, most of what I consider the most important events were attacks on religious freedom, but then were held back. That doesn't actually mean that, the American history is just studded with religious persecution, but it is true that the American commitment to religious freedom comes out of struggle. It doesn't come out of consensus. And so it's these fights that really made religious freedom into a reality. And there are a number of them, but let me just mention a few
Yeah.
that I think are especially important. Beginning with the Bible Wars, they're often called, in the especially the 1840s and into the 1850s, when public schools were invented. And it's important to know, a lot of people don't realize we didn't have public schools at the founding. The public school systems were not created until the really beginning in the early 1830s and on a state by state basis. And once public schools came in existence, the question of how children will be taught ceased to be a matter of private choice uh, and became a matter of governmental policy. And for many people, maybe even the vast majority of people, religion was always part of the education that was provided for their children. And as long as that was done, privately, it didn't result in legal problems. But once there were public schools, what are you going to do? Are you going to have a Bible reading? Almost everyone was in favor of using the Bible and teaching the Bible in the schools. But what Bible are they going to teach? Are they going to teach the King James Bible, which was the predominant Bible to use, or were they going to use translations that were more appropriate for Catholic school children? Now, we could get into the theological difference between these translations, which were profound. I'll put that aside and just note that there were these
Yeah.
differences that were deeply held. And so there were a number of important events in Philadelphia. The school system decided that they would allow Catholic students to read from their own Douay, as translation is the one they wanted to use, their own translation of the Bible. And this infuriated the Protestant majority in Philadelphia, leading to 3 days of rioting in, I believe it was 1844, where uh, Protestant mobs rampaged. A Catholic church was burned down. It was a terrible event. A similar, actually, this is a dramatic but much like smaller scale. In individual schools, Catholic school children were sometimes punished for refusing to read from the King James Bible. There's a case in the state of Maine where a Catholic schoolboy refused to do that, and he was caned in the class repeatedly uh,
Mm.
to punish him for his refusal. And in a case called Commonwealth versus Cook, this is actually upheld as being legitimate. So those Bible wars were a key event. It took a long time for the public schools to cease to be a place of where basically I call it the Protestant hegemony, where the Protestant hegemony was not enforced. A second set of events had to do with a Mormon church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who were unpopular for a variety of reasons. And again, deep theology here. We could talk about what those reasons are, but I'm not going to. Just you know,
Yep. Yep.
the Mormons are extremely unpopular, and at one point in the state of Missouri, under President Martin Van Buren, the governor of Missouri told the Mormons that they had to get out of the state or they would be exterminated. And then they fled across the river to Illinois, where they flourished for a time, and then they were driven out of Illinois too. And they had their great trek in 1847 out to what is now the state of Utah. And they chose that because at that time it was part of Mexico, and so they were getting out of the way of American intolerance. And then once the Mexican War came, they were part of the U.S. Just before the U.S. Civil War, we almost had a fighting war on which the United States was going to be attacking the Mormon settlements in Utah, we don't know what would have happened, but there surely would have been a lot of bloodshed. The largest single army encampment in the United States in the mid 1850s was just south of Salt Lake City. The reason that didn't, and the Mormons moved their capital from Salt Lake City to a more defensible redoubt in southern Utah to try to protect themselves. This was a very nasty situation.
Yeah.
And the reason it didn't happen is because the U.S. Civil War broke out, and we had better things to do than to use the army against the Mormons of Utah. But it didn't end there. There were a series of statutes. Of course, the main sticking point, not the only one, but the main sticking point was polygamy, the practice in the Mormon Church where leading male members of the church would be uh, required or permitted or required, often required, to marry a number of women, like large numbers. I think Brigham Young had, I think, 27 wives, and this practice lasted until the 1890s, but there were repeated arrests. Many people in Utah today, have ancestors like great grandfathers or great great grandfathers. I don't know how far back, but pictures of them in prison jumpsuits where they were imprisoned in Sugar House Prison and Salt Lake City for their religious practice
Yeah.
here, and eventually the Mormons gave that up, really more because of government pressure than anything else. Another series of events had to do with the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are also like deeply unpopular. Here, it's partly theological, but partly because people found them so annoying, knocking on people's doors and and playing recordings, including anti-Catholic recordings in the case of one Supreme Court case. Anyway, the Jehovah's Witnesses were abused city. This is usually at the city level, and the witnesses were just as stubborn as could be, and and we should celebrate that stubbornness because they just refused to knuckle under, and they fought in the courts, and many of the most important victories for freedom of speech and freedom of the press in the United States were as a result of Jehovah's Witnesses sticking to their principles in the face of persecution, and eventually the courts standing up for their right to be able to speak, to be able to preach, to be able to proselytize, and so forth. And then another set of controversies, somewhat more recent. Um, after World War II, as Catholic populations increased, and especially in the large cities of the East and Midwest, the Catholics tended to form their own schools, partly because of the Protestant character of the public schools, and partly for other reasons as well. And so there were Catholic school systems in many of the large cities of America. And the question became, should they receive any government assistance? I mean, Catholic families were paying property taxes just like anyone else. Their schools were accredited. Their kids could go there. They were real schools. They were real, providing real
Right.
education
Yeah.
and all the necessary subjects, and thus accomplishing what the purpose of education is. Well, should they get any benefit from school taxation? And as anti-Catholic prejudice declined a little bit and after World War II, increasingly some states and especially in the Northeast and Midwest said, well, yes, and fairness demands that they should be able to get something. Some at the beginning was just, tidbits. It was like they would be able
Yeah.
to get bus transportation paid for, or some of their textbooks paid for, or and then when the baby boom hit the public schools and the public schools were overcrowded, And also for a variety of reasons, including the growth of women's education out in the workforce and the decline of free labor from Catholic nuns to be teachers. The expenses of Catholic education went up. They were closing, and many states found that it was better to give some sort of subsidy to keep the Catholic schools operable rather than having those schools close and throw all those Catholic kids into an already overcrowded public school system.
Right.
And yet there was vicious opposition to doing this, from organizations like one called Protestants and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State. There was lots of and the courts were quite receptive to these challenges. So, beginning in 1971, in a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, the Supreme Court adopted a more separationist. That was the neutral term used, separationist idea of what the religious freedom clauses of the Bill of Rights required. And by separation, they meant that Catholic schools should not be able to share in what otherwise was neutrally provided. And so a non-public secular school could get money, but a non-public Catholic school or religious school would not be able to. And so there was a period of time between Lemon versus Kurtzman in 1971 and the turn of the century when there were dozens of cases in the courts. I litigated on several of the important cases during this period. And then in in the early 2000s, the Supreme Court finally realized that neutrality was the better course, and that schools should be treated neutrally, whether they're religious or not. It's really none of the government's business whether they are religious or secular, and they ought to treat them all equally. And that has become, in the intervening years since 2000, has become really a bedrock of religious freedom. And I just wouldn't mention one more thing, because anti-Catholicism, Catholics were the largest hated religious minority, and anti-Catholicism ran deep in American history, from the attempts to keep them out of New York back in 1777 all the way to modern times. And the election of John F. Kennedy as president in 1960, I think, was a key shifting point, because Kennedy was a Roman Catholic, openly so. He was opposed partly on the basis of his religion. He went down to Texas to speak, gave a very important speech to the Houston Ministerial Association about why having a Catholic president was not something that the country should fear. He was elected, and I mean, it was a very close election, so I don't mean to say he was overwhelmingly elected, but he was elected, and was a figure that many of us greatly admire. And he really proved that you can have Catholic presidents and Catholic leaders, and given the anti-Catholicism that pervaded American history, that was an important point. So, now we've had other Catholic presidents like Joe Biden since then. We've had Catholic speakers of the House. A majority of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court today are Roman Catholic. And so breaking that barrier, I think, was also a really important thing. And I think it helps other religious minorities as well. So when Joe Lieberman was the first Orthodox Jewish person to run for president or vice president, he ran for vice president. It was noted, but it was not a subject of great opposition.
Yeah.
And now we have Islamic office holders, and the idea that religious minorities can fully participate in the political life of the nation, I think, was greatly assisted by John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's interesting to sort of see those minority religions and the very large outsized roles they played as they tried to carve out for themselves their religious freedom. Like you said at the beginning, it wasn't just given to them. It was in the Constitution, but they had to, push against what did you call it? The Protestant hegemony, to secure that religious freedom,
And
right?
each religious minority that succeeds opens the door for others
Yep,
as well.
yep, yep,
And I
absolutely.
have to say, right now, in terms of the of litigation in the courts, there is a remarkable kind of joining of hands among and across religions. Islamic, Orthodox Jewish, evangelical, Catholic, like across the whole spectrum. There is a considerable degree, not 100%, but a considerable degree of cooperation and mutual support when it
Yeah,
comes to issues of religious freedom, because I think most of the religions of America have learned the lesson that it has to be freedom for everybody if there's going to be freedom for anybody.
yeah. But when did that start to take shape like that? That they began to work in solidarity in large numbers? Is that fairly recent or decades ago?
I can't put a date to it, and I think there was to some extent, it was probably gradual at the
Yeah.
first, but I think that has been true at least since the 1980s. And then when Congress passed what's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which provided a broader free exercise protection than the Supreme Court was willing to give, that really solidified it, because
Okay.
the coalition that supported that legislation just absolutely spanned the religious gamut.
Okay. You mentioned a few cases. The, did you talk? Do you want to talk about a few other cases that brought us from then to now, uh, or should we move on to the last question?
The courts have played a very important role
Yeah. So
in
let's get you
religious
saying some stuff.
freedom. Although I hope that people thinking about this realize that the courts aren't everything.
Yeah.
And unless the American people are committed to religious freedom, and by that I don't mean just for themselves, but for people even that they seriously disagree with, uh, the courts are going to that's going to be a feckless thing on paper. It really requires the hearts of the American people for religious freedom and other civil liberty to flourish. But the courts have played an important role. In the early years, these things were fought out in the various state Supreme Courts, and it's hard to point to specific cases. But the religious freedom provisions of the Bill of Rights were first treated as applying to the states in 1940, and since then the U.S. Supreme Court has been a very important voice. Um, I think for ill as well as for good, because as I mentioned before, there was a period of associated with the case of Lemon versus Kurtzman, where the court adopted a version of strict separation that was effectively hostile to religious diversity, at least within public education, but had a certain effect across the board. The court since about 2000 has been much more pluralistic, much more emphasizing neutrality
Yeah.
about religion. That's been important. There was one time, I think this is a really important set of events, and
Okay.
in the midst of World War II, uh, the children in public schools were being punished for not being willing to pledge allegiance to the flag. And the opposition to this was not led by, anti-American people. It wasn't like communists or Nazis or
Right.
whatever. It wasn't anti-American. It was led by Jehovah's Witnesses, who had a religious reason. They didn't pledge allegiance to the flag because it's only God who deserves that kind of allegiance,
Right.
and they were being punished. And the Supreme Court, in a case called Minersville versus Gobitis in 1940, held that it was okay under the Bill of Rights to force school children to say the Pledge of Allegiance. After that decision, and this just shows how influential court cases can be well beyond their terms, that after that case, there was a wave of persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses because the Supreme Court didn't say that was okay, but in a sense,
Right.
that case was treated as a permission slip for persecution. And just 3 years later, in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, the court changed its mind and said, no, actually, public schools can't force school children to say the Pledge of Allegiance. In an extremely eloquent opinion, possibly the most eloquent defense of freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom of religion in the whole annals of the Supreme Court. And this was, and that, I think that reversal from Gobitis to Barnett might be the turning point, the place where the U.S. courts, and especially the Supreme Court, began to be serious about the idea of freedom of religion.
Okay. That's fantastic. I really appreciate your thoughts as to the importance, yes, of court cases, but of the supreme importance of the American people themselves and how they uh, view and support or do not support religious freedom. So let's get to the last question, Michael, and we'll let you go. As we conclude here, do you want to share any further lessons or takeaways from the topic, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed in your long career, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in this American narrative?
So I think there was a major misunderstanding when I was younger. This may be true of you too as well, Chris. It was commonly taught and believed, and the Supreme Court repeatedly said that there was a so-called tension between the idea of free exercise of religion and the idea of non-establishment of religion, both ideas being in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, indeed in the same sentence, separated only by a comma. And there was this mythology that around this, that the Establishment Clause was a product of the secular Enlightenment and was, part of getting the American culture away from its religiosity into more of a secular mode. And so this was restraining religion from its dangerous tendencies, and that free exercise was more of a product of religious people wanting to be able to practice their religion, and that these two things were in conflict, and that was the prevailing view in the Supreme Court. I'm personally rather proud of my role in resisting this. This is beginning in the early 1980s. I began litigating cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, and this was a major theme of the briefs and arguments that I was making, because it just isn't true as a historical matter or as a civil libertarian matter. The Establishment Clause was not backed by the secular Enlightenment folks existed. There were people like Jefferson, there were people like Benjamin Franklin, but they were for both disestablishment and free exercise. But much more important than that were the religious shock troops demanding religious freedom. Here, the Baptists, are like the most important figures, but not the only religious figures. It was the most religious, the most intensely religious and evangelical elements in America who fought against establishment of religion. And that's because they believe that government control of religion was bad for religious liberty and bad for religion. They didn't want the so-called helping hand of government. They wanted government to get out of this. So these two clauses were seen as mutually supporting. They were not seen as in tension with each other. They both had to do with they were, and they were not. Neither of them was anti-religious. Neither of them had Neither had the project of making America more secular. People are free to be secular in America, but that's left up to conviction and persuasion. The Constitution doesn't push in that direction, and the idea is that the two clauses work together, not pro-religion or anti-religion, as I think they were so often seen, but rather as against government control, whether it is government control that ostensibly is helping religion or government control that is in fact contrary to religion. And here that almost always meant minority religions, but those two clauses work in tandem. I think the Supreme Court has realized that. I don't know whether high school curricula now teach these things differently than they did when I was in high school, but I'm hoping the idea is beginning to sink in that there is no conflict between not having government control of religion and having government freedom. Those are part and parcel of the same idea.
Okay. Well, you have the last word, and I should say thank you for your work on this over the decades. We have been talking with Michael McConnell, Faculty Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School, Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution, and co-author with Nathan Chapman of Agreeing to Disagree: How the Establishment Clause Protects Religious Diversity and Freedom of Conscience. Michael, thanks so much for being here with us. It was super. What you said made us better equipped to be more successful stewards of religious freedom's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government.
Thank you, Chris.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.